May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. So for the last 7 years, I have been investigating what the Bible and other spiritual literature reveal about how humans ask questions of suffering and injustice, and how God seems to respond to these questions when they are directed towards him in prayer or lament. In general, I found that God seems to respond with revelations of love, as he does to Julian of Norwich, or sometimes with invitations to trust, and other times with calls to action. There's a wonderful meme that Molly shared with me in which a young man is sitting on a bench next to Jesus and asks Jesus, "So why do you allow things like famine, war, suffering, disease, crime, homelessness, despair, etc. to exist in our world?" And Jesus responds, "Interesting you should bring that up, as I was about to ask you the exact same question." So sometimes God responds to our questions of suffering in that way, with a call to action, a call to take responsibility, a call to participate in the alleviation of such ubiquitous pain and misery. And a few months ago, my prayers were mostly questions to God as I reflected on the deaths of some of my closest friends and serious illnesses within my own family. And also in the last few days, regarding the escalating violence at Standing Rock in South Dakota, as Native Americans are protesting against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is desecrating their sacred burial grounds and contaminating their water. And although it seems somewhat trivial in comparison, I was also asking questions about next steps in my own vocation. I had some job offers and possibilities that didn't feel quite right, and I was wondering what God was up to. So one day, while visiting my parents in Cupertino with my wife Ashley, we prayed together for healing and guidance as I brought some of these questions to God in prayer. And my past experience in bringing questions to God and my doctoral research had given me good reason to believe that God responds to our questions, even though we might not notice it or understand it at the time. After praying with my family, I glanced at my father's bookshelf and saw a book which almost seemed to see me. I don't know if you've had that experience where you see something that almost seems to see you and say to me, "Take up and read," like the Bible basically did to St. Augustine. And it was this book by a former professor of Jewish mysticism and ethics, a great job title, Jewish Mysticism and Ethics, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Abraham Joshua Heschel, a social activist as well. And it's a book called The Prophets. And it's about the ancient Hebrew prophets who often asked God questions and then experienced divine responses. And I opened the book and saw a stamp on the title page from its former owner, which included the former owner's home address, which happened to be in San Rafael, which I thought was interesting since I'd already been working in San Rafael for several years. And I then turned to the opening paragraph and read the following. "This book is about some of the most disturbing people who have ever lived." So I was already hooked. "The men whose inspiration brought the Bible into being, the men whose image is our refuge in distress, and whose voice and vision sustain our faith." I knew right there and then that I was going to be spending some quality time with the prophets this year. And the fact that this year's Sunday lectionary includes readings mostly from the prophets when it comes to the Hebrew selection, I was inspired to make these disturbing people the focus of the program year for the Marin Episcopal Youth Group. And our theme is about sharpening our prophetic edge. And we've been reading from the prophets and learning about what it means to be prophetic in today's world. And the youth love these stories of these bizarre, disturbing people. And our reading this morning from the prophets is from the book of Habakkuk, or Habakkuk. And tonight the youth group will probably read the whole book, which is no major feat because it's only about 3 chapters long, and I would encourage you to read it as well. You've already heard about a fifth of it. Habakkuk is one of the 12 minor prophets who likely lived in Jerusalem during the last decades before the Babylonian invasion of the southern kingdom of Israel, which was called Judah. This was around the 6th century BCE. And a fun fact about Habakkuk that is appropriate for this time of year is that in the 15th century, Renaissance artist Donatello sculpted a famous statue of the prophet, which he referred to lovingly as Lo Zacconi, which is Italian for pumpkin head, because his head apparently somewhat resembles a pumpkin or a jack-o'-lantern. I have a picture if you want to see. The statue is so realistic, it's considered one of the most realistic sculptures of the 15th century. And it said that while Donatello was sculpting it, he shouted, "Speak to me, speak to me." So for Donatello, Habakkuk was a kind of pumpkin-headed Frankenstein monster. So it's appropriate for this time of year. And although Habakkuk probably never spoke to Donatello, he did indeed speak to God. And that is part of what makes him actually very unique among the Hebrew prophets. Most of the prophets spoke to the people on God's behalf. But Habakkuk spoke to God on the people's behalf. In Habakkuk's day, the people of Judah suffered under corrupt leaders who committed disturbing acts of injustice and idolatry, including child sacrifice. Habakkuk's prophetic pronouncement, which we just read, is not to the people, but to God. He asks, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you not listen? Why are you not saving the innocent from the violence of the wicked? Why do you allow justice to be perverted?" This is the bold chutzpah of Habakkuk, whose prayers are questions charged with confusion, frustration, and even anger and accusation. And the amazing grace is that God responds to his questions. In fact, the whole book of Habakkuk is a back-and-forth dialogue and wrestling and argument with the divine, which is fitting because Habakkuk's name means wrestler. And God initially responds to the wrestling prophet's questions by describing how he will execute judgment against the corrupt leaders of Judah by using the rampaging violence of the even more corrupt leaders of Babylon. Habakkuk, however, does not like this response at all. And because he is a Hebrew prophet, he has the wherewithal and the chutzpah to push back and say, "Hold on, wait a minute. The leaders of Judah are bad, but not as bad as the leaders of Babylon. God, are you telling me that we only have 2 options for leadership? One that is corrupt and another that is basically a self-obsessed bully on a violent rampage?" So that question may resonate with many of us. Are these the only options? God, where are you in all of this? And so once again, Habakkuk lodges his questions and complaints against God, asking, how can you be a good and loving God in the midst of all this violence? How can this be happening with this all-powerful, all-loving God? And that is also a question that we have been asking, especially some members of the Bishop's Committee, in light of, again, the violence at Standing Rock. How? Apologists ask, how can this be? In which Native Americans are the victims of violence and betrayal over centuries. And in this case, we are Babylon, invading and taking over and committing genocide. How can this be? And that is the question that Habakkuk asks right before the second part of our reading. As you see in our readings, it's a selection from chapter 1 and a selection from chapter 2. And in between, it's God's first response. And as he asks this question, he says, "I will stand at my watchpost and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what he will say to me and what he will answer concerning my complaint." So just as Zacchaeus climbs up the sycamore tree to see what this Jesus guy is all about, so too does Habakkuk climb up the rampart to see what God is all about and how God will respond when consistently confronted with the prophet's bold questions. And God responds indeed, once again. And this time God responds with revelations of love and invitations to trust, invitations to live by faith. The righteous shall live by faith. We don't know all the details of this particular vision, but we do know it was profoundly transformative for the prophet. Heschel writes, Habakkuk's vision remains unknown to us. Its content is not put into words. It clearly was a vision of redemption at the end of days. There is an answer to Habakkuk's question. It is an answer not in terms of thought, but in terms of events. God's answer will happen, but it cannot be spelled out in words. The answer will surely come. If it seems slow, wait for it. True, the interim is hard to bear. The righteous one is horrified by what he sees. To this, the great answer is given. The righteous shall live by his faith. It is an answer, again, not in terms of thought, but in terms of existence. Prophetic faith is trust in him, in whose presence stillness is a form of understanding. So God seems to respond to Habakkuk's question the way he responds to the similarly bold questions of the medieval English mystic, Julian of Norwich, who I love to talk about. She's considered maybe the greatest English theologian ever. That's what Thomas Merton says. And when she brings her bold questions to God, God responds in a similar way, saying, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And we know that God's response to Habakkuk was transformative for the prophet because he concludes his book with this magnificent prayer and these poetic words of bold faith. He says, though the fig tree does not blossom and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exult in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer, so that I can walk freely upon the heights. God responds to the Chutzpah of Habakkuk by giving him faith and insight to thrive at new spiritual heights. And God responded to my own questions several months ago through this book by Heschel in more ways than one. As I was asking God for insight about the next steps in my vocation, this book showed up, I believe, as part of God's response. And as I was revisiting this book just a few days ago in preparation for the sermon, I looked again at the stamp of its former owner and realized that through this book, God had actually been pointing me to this community and to this next beautiful season in my vocation before Redeemer was even on my radar. This book, which I saw a few months ago on my father's bookshelf in Cupertino, which he bought years ago at a used bookstore, was initially owned by a man named Jeremy Blodgett, beloved former vicar of this parish. Came back around. So God responds to our questions in surprising and sometimes playful ways, if we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. So as we enter tomorrow into this fall triduum of All Hallows Eve, All Hallows Day, and All Souls Day, I invite us to bring our questions to God in prayer or lament as we remember those loved ones whom we have lost, as the nights become darker and longer, and the days become darker as well, apparently. And may we have the chutzpah to climb atop the ramparts like Habakkuk, or the sycamore tree like Zacchaeus, and allow ourselves to be transformed by God's response. Amen.